Raleigh, North Carolina, 5:32 p.m. The late afternoon sun slanted through the quiet neighborhood of Brook Hollow in Raleigh, North Carolina, painting the wooden fences and freshly mowed lawns in shades of gold. At the edge of the yard at number 14, Mason Reed set down his hedge clippers on the grass and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He had moved into this fixer-upper just 4 days ago. The paint on the walls was peeling. The fence leaned at an awkward angle, and ivy climbed wildly along the property line. But it was far from Charlotte, far from the house where every corner still carried Hannah's ghost. 2 years had passed since the car accident took his wife. 2 years of raising 7-year-old Owen alone. 2 years of trying to answer questions that had no good answers. Why doesn't Mom make pancakes anymore? Why does Dad stare at her empty chair so long? Why does the house feel so quiet? Mason hadn't moved to Raleigh because he believed in fresh starts. He moved because staying in the old house was slowly killing both of them. Now he worked long days, fixing porches, building decks, and landscaping yards around the neighborhood, just to keep the bills paid and food on the table. In the 4 days he'd been here, he'd hardly seen the woman next door at number 12. Just occasional glimpses, collecting mail, pulling curtains closed, standing at the window, staring down the street as if waiting for something she both feared and expected. Today was the first time she had stood on her porch for so long. She was holding a medium-sized cardboard box against her chest. At first glance, it didn't look heavy, but the way she gripped it told a different story. Her hands kept slipping, then desperately catching the box again. Her wrists trembled. Her chin was lifted in stubborn determination, as if lowering it would cause everything to crumble. Mason placed the clippers down where she could clearly see both his hands were empty and walked slowly toward the property line between their houses. "Need some help with that?" he asked, his voice just loud enough to carry. The woman startled violently as if he'd yelled. Her head whipped around. Dark brown hair brushed across her cheek. She was in her late 30s, attractive in a carefully maintained way, but today that polish showed small fractures, faint circles under her eyes, dry lips and shoulders held rigidly tight. "I'm okay," she answered immediately. The box nearly slipped from her grasp. Mason didn't smile. "Doesn't look like it." She studied him for several seconds, then glanced quickly down the street. There was nothing there but the fading light. "I'm just rearranging some things." "Mason Reed," he said, jerking his thumb toward his house. "I just bought the place next door. If you need help moving anything heavy, I can spare 10 minutes before I have to make dinner for my boy." Her eyes flicked over his calloused hands, the grass stains on his jeans, and the half-renovated house behind him. Then she spoke the sentence Mason would remember long after. "My husband is away." The way she said it sounded practiced, too smooth, too quick, like an excuse she had rehearsed many times. Mason simply nodded. "All right. He hates when other people touch things in the house," she added, swallowing hard. "But I need to move a few items. Today." It was Tuesday. The urgency in her voice didn't match an ordinary Tuesday at all. Mason stepped up onto the porch and reached for the box. When their fingers brushed, she jerked her hand back so fast it looked painful. She pressed that hand against her hip, forcing it to stay still. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason nodded toward the door. "Where to?" "Living room." As he crossed the threshold, she lingered one beat behind her hand, resting on the doorknob longer than necessary. The door closed softly. The lock clicked. Then the deadbolt slid into place with a heavy final sound, a short, sharp click that told Mason this was no longer simply about moving a box. The air inside the house felt cold. Not from the air conditioning, but from something deeper. The kind of cold that settles in when fear has lived there for too long. Mason carried the box into the living room, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The room was pristine, expensive furniture arranged with military precision pillows, perfectly aligned picture frames on the mantel balanced exactly. It looked more like a showroom than a home. The woman pointed to a spot near the couch. "Just set it there for now." Mason did as she asked, then straightened up. He wiped his palms on his jeans. "Anything else?" She shook her head quickly, eyes darting to the window again. "No, that's all for now." But her voice wavered, and Mason could see the way her shoulders stayed tense, as if waiting for something to go wrong. He took a step back toward the door, but something in his chest wouldn't let him leave just yet. Owen was inside waiting for dinner, probably drawing at the kitchen table like he always did. But the fear in this woman's eyes reminded Mason too much of the nights after Hannah's accident, when the silence in their own house had felt like a weight he couldn't lift alone. He paused at the threshold. "If you change your mind about needing more help, just knock on the wall. I'm right next door." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. Then she gave a small nod. Mason stepped outside into the warm evening air, the door closing behind him, with another soft click. As he crossed the grass back to his own house, the weight of that deadbolt still echoed in his mind. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening inside number 12, it wasn't just about rearranging a few things. And for the first time in a long time, Mason Reed realized he couldn't simply walk away. Mason pushed open his own front door, the echo of that deadbolt from next door still ringing in his ears. He couldn't simply walk away. Not when the fear in her eyes reminded him so much of the nights after Hannah's accident, when the silence in their house had felt like a weight he couldn't lift alone. Inside the house smelled of the spaghetti sauce he had simmering on the stove. Owen was sitting at the kitchen table, his small hand moving a crayon across a sheet of paper in steady, careful strokes. The boy looked up, his eyes bright, but carrying that old sadness Mason knew too well. "Dad, did you help the neighbor lady?" Owen asked, feet swinging under the chair. "Yeah, Buddy," Mason said, ruffling the boy's hair. "She's got some heavy stuff to move." Just then there was a soft knock on the connecting wall, soft, but urgent. Mason's heart tightened. He told Owen he'd be back soon and stepped back out. The woman was standing on her porch again. "There's one more thing," she said quietly, "if you don't mind." Mason followed her inside once more. This time she pointed to a massive oak cabinet in the living room, dark and ornate, the kind of furniture that screamed power rather than comfort. "That one," she said. "I want it out, in the garage, or even the curb. I don't care." Mason eyed it. "At least 300 pounds. Solid wood. I can move it, but we'll need to clear the doors and pad the floor. I'll help." "No," he said firmly. "You open the doors. I'll handle the rest." She rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that looked too thin for the life she seemed to lead. As Mason tilted the cabinet forward, the back pulled away from the wall, and he saw it. A patched section of drywall, oval-shaped, fresh and rough, right at head height. He didn't ask. But she stared at the patch as if it had just slapped her across the face. "He bought that cabinet," she said, her voice almost not directed at Mason, but at the room itself. "He really liked it." Mason pushed the cabinet onto a blanket he had grabbed from the sofa. "It's ugly." The woman blinked. Then a small, real smile, broke through against her will. "Yeah," she said softly. "It is ugly as hell." As Mason slowly dragged the cabinet through the hallway toward the garage, she walked ahead to open doors. But he noticed every time they passed a window, she glanced out to the street. Not the curious glance of a neighbor, but the watchful gaze of someone counting the minutes before a car turned into the driveway. When they reached the garage, Mason set the cabinet down with a heavy breath. Done. She leaned lightly against the door frame, one hand gripping her other elbow. "Thank you." Mason wiped his hands on his jeans. "Anything else that needs moving?" She glanced at the clock on the garage wall. 5:44. "No, you should go." The words came too fast, too final. Not like a polite goodbye. More like she had just remembered an invisible deadline closing in. Mason leaned against the old bicycle in the corner. Someone calling at 6. The woman froze. Then she turned away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You keep looking at the clock," he said, lowering his voice. "Keep glancing at the street. Keep locking doors like you're afraid someone will walk in without knocking. I'm not stupid." She was silent for a long time. Finally she said, "My name is Elise Hart." Mason nodded. "All right, Elise. My husband is Richard." She closed her eyes for a second. "He's not on a business trip. He's just not home tonight. And you needed the cabinet out before he gets back." Elise didn't confirm, but her trembling hands said everything. "I won't call the police," she said quickly, as if he hadn't even suggested it. "I can't. Not yet." Mason wasn't surprised. There were people who didn't run from violence because they like suffering. They didn't run because the other person held something bigger, money lawyers, kids, reputation fear that had been fed for too long. "I'm right next door," he said. "If you need anything, knock on the wall." Elise looked at him. Gratitude and panic fought behind her eyes. "You have a son?" she said, as if reminding him he should stay away. "Yeah." "Then don't get involved in my mess." Mason looked straight at her. "You already pulled me inside." He left. After that, crossing the grass back to his house. Owen was still at the table, crayon in hand. "Dad is... she sad?" Mason set his tools down throat tight. "Maybe." Owen colored another line of blue. Mom was sad before she went to the hospital a lot, but she still smiled. Mason turned to the fridge just to give his hand something to do. Hannah had done the same, smiled, even when it hurt. At exactly 6 o'clock from the kitchen window, Mason watched the lights come on in Elise's kitchen. Her silhouette stood straight, one hand holding the phone, the other pressed flat on the counter as if she needed it to stay upright. She spoke for 20 straight minutes. No pacing, no sitting, just standing like a soldier waiting for orders. When the call ended, she stood still a few seconds longer. Then she drew the curtains closed. Mason's chest tightened. An hour later, the rain began to fall in soft, steady drops, and he decided he wasn't going to sit still anymore. Mason decided he wasn't going to sit still anymore. He left Owen with Mrs. June, the widow, at the end of the street, who always kept cookies for the boy. She took one look at Mason's face and didn't ask questions. "Go on," she said softly. "He'll be fine with me." The rain had grown heavier by the time Mason crossed the wet grass between the two houses. It beat against his jacket and slicked his hair to his forehead. He climbed the steps of number 12 and knocked twice. Elise opened the door almost instantly, as if she had been standing right behind it. Her hair was damp at the temples, her eyes darker than before. The careful polish from earlier was gone. She looked like a woman holding herself together, with nothing but willpower. Mason, she started, then corrected herself. I mean, come in. He stepped inside. The house still carried that same cold fear, but now it mixed with the scent of rain and the faint trace of red wine she must have poured to steady her nerves. She didn't offer him a seat. Instead, she stood at the kitchen counter, fingers wrapped tight around a glass. He called at exactly 6, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Just like always. He asked where I was, what I was wearing, whether I'd touched anything in the house. Then he asked about the cabinet. She gave a short, bitter laugh. He remembered exactly where it stood. He always remembers. Mason stayed quiet, letting her speak. He doesn't have cameras. She continued, he just knows. Or he wants me to think he knows. It's the same thing after a while. She set the glass down but didn't let go of it. Her knuckles were white. I told him the cabinet was still there, she said. I lied. For the first time in years, I lied to him. Mason could hear the rain hammering the roof. And he believed you. For now. She looked toward the front door. But he's coming home early. He said so. He never comes home early unless something feels wrong. Mason didn't move closer. He knew better than to crowd someone who had lived inside fear for so long. You don't have to face him alone. Her eyes met his. Gratitude and terror warred behind them. You have a son, Mason. You shouldn't be here. I already am. The words hung between them. Then the doorbell rang. One sharp note. Then 2 more in quick succession. Then 3 hard, impatient knocks. Elise froze. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the tile. She didn't even look down. It's him, she breathed. Mason was already moving. Stay here. He walked down the hallway and opened the front door before Richard could knock again. The man standing on the porch was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored vest under a raincoat hair, perfectly in place despite the downpour. His face was handsome in the cold, polished way of someone who had never been told no. Richard Hart. And who exactly are you? Richard asked, his voice smooth and low. Neighbor Mason answered. Interesting. Richard's eyes slid past Mason's shoulder into the house. My wife doesn't usually entertain neighbors this late. Behind Mason, Elise had stepped into the hallway. Her hand gripped the doorframe so tightly the wood creaked. Richard, she said, forcing her voice steady. You're home early. I am. Richard took 1 step up onto the porch. Mason didn't move. Step aside. No. Richard's gaze sharpened. You're the handyman from next door, aren't you? The one who bought the fixer-upper. He gave a small, pitying smile. Elise has always had a soft spot for strays. Elise's face went pale. Mason felt her fear like a live wire in the air. She asked me to help move some furniture, Mason said evenly. That's all. Richard's smile never reached his eyes. And now you're inside my house after dark. Interesting choice, Elise. She asked me to stay, Mason said. Richard turned his attention fully to his wife. Tell this man to leave Elise. Now. Elise's lips parted, but no sound came. For 1 terrible second, Mason thought she would obey out of habit. Then something shifted behind her eyes, small but real. The cabinet is in the garage, she said quietly. I moved it. Richard's expression didn't change, but the air around him grew colder. You moved it. Yes. Mason could see the calculation happening behind Richard's eyes. This wasn't the screaming, violent kind of rage. This was worse controlled, precise, the kind that destroyed lives without leaving visible bruises. You know how much I dislike surprises, Richard said softly, still looking only at Elise. We'll discuss this inside. Alone. She doesn't want you inside tonight, Mason said. Richard finally looked at him again. This is my house. Half of it is hers. A long silence stretched between the three of them. Rain drummed on the porch roof. Richard adjusted his coat sleeve with deliberate calm. Elise, he said, voice still gentle, tell your new friend to go home before this becomes unpleasant. Elise took one small step forward. Her voice shook, but she spoke clearly. He's staying. For the first time, Richard's mask cracked. Not much, just a tightening at the corner of his mouth, but Mason saw it. Fine, Richard said at last. Tonight, then. He took one step backward into the rain. But you know this doesn't end here, Elise. You know exactly how this ends. He turned and walked down the step shoes, splashing through puddles, and disappeared into the black sedan waiting at the curb. The taillights faded into the storm. Mason closed the door and locked it. When he turned around, Elise had slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees. She wasn't sobbing loudly. The tears came silently, the kind that had been held back for years. Mason crouched a few feet away, giving her space. You're safe. Right now, he said, quietly. She shook her head. He'll come back. He always comes back. Maybe Mason answered. But next time he won't find the same woman he left here tonight. Elise looked up at him through wet lashes. The fear was still there, but something new had joined it. Something small and fragile that looked a lot like hope. Mason stayed right where he was, rain dripping from his jacket onto the floor, listening as the storm raged outside, and the house inside finally felt a fraction less cold. He wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Not until she told him to. Elise wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at Mason for a long moment. The rain outside had eased into a steady drizzle, but inside the house, the silence felt heavier than before. She drew a shaky breath and spoke, her voice raw but steady for the first time that night. He'll come back, she said again. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. But he always does. And when he does, he won't yell or break things. He'll just make everything my fault. The lawyers are on his payroll. The accounts are joint, but he controls the transfers. Even my sister thinks I'm exaggerating. Everyone sees the nice house, the vacations, the man in the perfect vest. No one sees the way he tracks every minute of my day. Mason stayed crouched where he was, elbows on his knees, listening without interrupting. He had seen this kind of fear before, not in his own marriage, but in the quiet desperation of people he had worked for over the years. Men and women who smiled in public and disappeared behind closed doors. You don't have to explain it all tonight, he said gently. But if you ever decide you want out, you should have options ready. Not because you're running scared, but because you deserve the choice. Elise stared at the shattered glass on the floor as if seeing it for the first time. What kind of options? A bag. Mason answered. Something small you can grab in 2 minutes. Passport or ID. A change of clothes, any cash you can pull without him noticing, copies of important papers, photos of bruises if you have them, medication, a phone charger. Even a spare key to somewhere safe, just so the decision to leave isn't made in panic. She was quiet for nearly a minute. Then she nodded, once small and uncertain, and stood up. I think I have some things upstairs. The next 2 hours passed in a strange, focused rhythm. They moved through the house like people preparing for a quiet evacuation. Elise pulled a plain gray duffel from the back of her closet, while Mason kept watch at the windows. She gathered bank statements she had hidden in an old shoe box, her birth certificate, and a small flash drive with scanned medical records. Mason took clear photos with his phone of the patched drywall and the faint bruise on her wrist that she had always called a kitchen accident. He helped her install 2 simple sliding bolts on the back door and the door to the garage cheap hardware from his truck that would buy her precious seconds if needed. They saved the domestic violence hotline number under a fake contact name in her phone. Mason showed her how to forward important emails to a new account Richard didn't know about. Every step felt heavy, but Elise's hands grew steadier as they worked. She didn't cry again. She simply moved with a quiet determination that Mason recognized as the first real crack in years of control. When the bag was packed and tucked under the bed, Elise sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at him. The house was silent except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. "What if I go to a hotel?" she asked. "Or a shelter?" "You could," Mason said. "But he'd find the card charges, he'd find the address, and you'd be alone." She swallowed. "You're suggesting your place. I'm saying the spare room is empty. Owen sleeps like a rock. The door's locked from the inside. And you wouldn't have to explain anything to him tonight. Just sleep. Decide in the morning." Elise stared at the floor. "You have a child, Mason, a life. If Richard finds out you helped me, he already knows I was here tonight." Mason cut in quietly. "And I'm not offering because I'm a hero. I'm offering because I know what it feels like to sit in an empty house after everything falls apart. I know what it feels like to be afraid to ask for help. I won't let you sit in that alone if I can stop it." She looked up at him, then really looked as if searching for any sign of pity or hidden motive. She found none, only the same steady patience he had shown when he first offered to carry that cardboard box. "I haven't said yes," she whispered. "I know," he replied. "You don't have to. The bag is ready. The bolts are on. If he shows up at 2 in the morning, you can still decide. But you won't have to decide while standing here by yourself." Elise's fingers traced the edge of the duffel strap. The rain had stopped completely now. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell quiet. The house felt different, still cold, still marked by years of fear, but no longer completely sealed off from the world. She gave the smallest nod. Not a full agreement. Not yet. But it was the first time she hadn't immediately refused the idea of being helped. Mason stood and offered her his hand. She took at her grip light, but real. Together they walked downstairs. He checked the locks one last time while she turned off the lights. When they stepped onto the porch, the night air smelled clean and wet, like something had been washed away. Across the grass, his own house glowed softly with the lamp he had left on for Owen. Mason felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his chest, not as a burden, but as something he had chosen. He wasn't just the neighbor anymore. He was part of whatever came next. And for the first time in 2 years, that didn't scare him. Richard returned the following Friday morning. He wasn't alone. 2 men in gray moving jackets stood beside him on the porch, clipboards in hand, and a stack of documents tucked under one arm. From his kitchen window, Mason saw the black sedan pull up in front of number 12. His stomach tightened. He knew this was the next move, legal on paper, but designed to strip away what little control Elise still had. He told Owen to finish his cereal and stay inside, then crossed the lawn in long strides. When he reached the porch, Richard was already inside the living room, pointing toward a small filing cabinet by the wall. Elise stood by the kitchen counter, face pale but her back straight. The 2 movers shifted uncomfortably, clearly, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Mason Richard said with that same smooth smile, "Perfect timing. I have paperwork here authorizing the removal of some premarital assets." No court order, Mason said flatly. Richard shrugged lightly. Not needed. These items were mine before the marriage. Elise stepped forward, her voice stronger than Mason had ever heard it. You wrote that list yourself. Richard turned to her, the smile cooling. You're making this ugly, Elise. No, she replied. I'm finally remembering. One of the movers cleared his throat. Mason pulled out his phone and dialed the domestic violence legal hotline they had saved 2 nights earlier. He put it on speaker. As the operator answered and began guiding them through the process, Elise produced a printed email, the confirmation of an 11 a.m. appointment with an independent family lawyer booked with a prepaid card. The 2 workers exchanged glances. After listening to the operator explain the risks of proceeding without proper documentation, both set their clipboards down. Sorry, Mr. Hart, one of them said. We're not getting involved in this. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He never did. Instead, he stared at Elise for a long moment, as if trying to remind her who she used to be. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. No. Elise answered, her voice steady. I'm finally correcting one. Richard turned and walked back to his car without another word. The sedan pulled away, leaving the street silent once more. 3 hours later, Elise sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Raleigh, signing the first set of documents that would begin the process of separating their assets and requesting a protective order. Mason waited outside with Owen, who was quietly coloring a picture of 2 houses side by side with a bright green fence between them. When Elise walked out, her eyes were red but clear. She looked at Mason and gave a small, tired smile. Step 1 is done. In the weeks that followed, Elise temporarily moved into Mason's spare room. Richard tried to push back through lawyers and threatening letters, but every move was now documented. Every call was recorded. The power he once held was slipping away. Together they began restoring number 12. Mason replaced the locks. Owen helped paint the porch railing a soft cream color. Elise planted lavender and roses along the front path. The house that had once felt like a cold museum slowly transformed into something warm and alive. One warm spring afternoon, as golden sunlight bathed the backyard, Elise stood in the garden they had rebuilt together. Mason walked up beside her, paint still on his fingers. Owen was laughing in the grass, chasing a butterfly with a plastic sword. Elise turned to Mason, her eyes soft. I used to think that if I ever left Richard, I would have nothing left. But now, I realize I was only waiting for someone who wouldn't look away. Mason didn't answer with words. He gently cupped her face with his paint-stained hand and kissed her slowly under the soft evening light. It wasn't a kiss of rescue. It was a kiss between 2 people who had survived the hardest part and chosen to build something new. In the house that had once been filled with fear, laughter now echoed. The cold rooms had become warm, and for the first time in many years, number 12 finally felt like a home.